Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to select the most effective exercises for hypertrophy training. Before getting into the details of how to select the most effective exercises for hypertrophy training, we first need to understand what the role of exercise selection is. Exercise selection is essentially just a means to stress the muscle through dynamic resistance training. It provides a way for us to dynamically contract a specific muscle against external load. This then stresses the muscle, disrupts homeostasis, and results in hypertrophy as an adaptation to this stress. We aren't going to go into any more detail about stress and adaptation, but it should just be understood that our physiology doesn't know which exercises we are performing. All it recognizes is stress and adapts accordingly. What this means is that there are no mandatory exercises for hypertrophy training. There are many different exercises which can all equally be effective. To decide which exercises are best for muscle growth, we also need to understand the concept of stimulus and fatigue. Every exercise we perform results in a hypertrophic stimulus and also induces fatigue. The stimulus side of the equation refers to the hypertrophic stimulus of the exercise. There are multiple factors which go into what makes an exercise more or less hypertrophic, and we'll be covering this in relation to exercise selection throughout this video. But essentially, we want to provide the best hypertrophic stimulus possible to result in the greatest muscle growth response. On the other side of the equation, we have fatigue. Fatigue consists of two subcategories which are both relevant to consider. First and most important for hypertrophy training is joint stress. This refers to the amount of training our joints or connective tissue can handle before experiencing pain or irritation. There is only a finite amount of stress each joint can handle before becoming irritated or injured over time. This is also influenced by exercise selection, since different exercises may place more or less stress on different tissues. Therefore, we want to preference exercises which have the least amount of joint stress. And the other form of fatigue necessary to mention is systemic fatigue. This refers to the overall fatigue of the entire organism, which affects all bodily systems. Once again, there is a finite amount of stress our body can handle before we experience negative health and performance consequences. This is not as relevant for hypertrophy training. It is more relevant for performance type training like strength or endurance training. However, we still want to try to minimize systemic fatigue. So essentially, the goal for exercise selection is twofold: to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus and to minimize fatigue. Throughout the rest of this video, we will explore how to select the most effective exercises to achieve this. It should also be noted that stimulus and fatigue are influenced by other factors too, like lifting technique. So while exercise selection does play a role, it is not the only influential factor. The first and most important consideration for exercise selection is the anatomy of the muscle being targeted and the biomechanics of the lift. Simply put, the exercise must train the target muscle. This means the exercise should require the muscle to dynamically contract against resistance in order to move the load. If the muscle is not required to work, then it won't be stressed, and it won't receive a hypertrophic stimulus. All muscles have a unique anatomical structure, so trainees should select exercises which train the target muscle appropriately. We won't go into detail on the anatomy of each muscle, we just need to understand that this is the most fundamental consideration for exercise selection. So once we know what general movement patterns will train the target muscle, the next consideration is muscle range of motion. This refers to the degree of muscle lengthening and contracting required by the muscle throughout the exercise. So even if two exercises both train the same muscle, one might take the muscle through a larger range of motion compared with the other. We generally want to preference the exercises which do train the muscle through a larger range of motion, as training at longer muscle lengths tends to result in superior muscle growth. For example, this study compared the hypertrophic effects of the seated versus the lying leg curl on hamstrings hypertrophy. Although both exercises have the same movement pattern and were trained with full range of motion, the seated leg curl resulted in superior muscle growth compared with the lying leg curl. This is likely because the seated curl trains the hamstrings at a longer muscle length, since the hamstrings are lengthened at the hip joint, whereas they are shortened at the hip during the lying leg curl. So as this study demonstrates, Training a muscle at a longer length tends to result in greater muscle growth. Therefore, we should preference exercises which train the target muscle through a larger range of motion, as this will train the muscle at longer lengths. With all other factors being equal, this will likely result in a superior hypertrophic stimulus. The next consideration for exercise selection is the tension curve of the exercise. This refers to the degree of stress on the target muscle throughout the range of motion of a single exercise. This is a complex phenomenon and could be an entire video in itself, so we won't go into too much detail. But essentially, we ideally want to stress the muscle relatively equally throughout the entire range of motion. In reality, it is basically impossible to get a perfectly even tension curve throughout the entire range of motion, since the strength curve of each muscle group and movement pattern is naturally variable at different points. However, we certainly can provide a more even tension curve with strategic exercise selection. Exactly how this is achieved will be specific to each exercise and muscle group, but we can explore an example to help understand this concept more clearly. Barbell rows are a good example to explain this idea. This movement pattern naturally has a descending tension curve. This means it is easier at the start of the lift when the arms are extended, and harder at the end of the lift when the barbell is close to the body. So the issue here is that if we use a light load to maintain strict form, there will be minimal tension at the beginning of the lift, and we only really get a significant stimulus at the end range. And if we use a heavier load, we won't be able to perform full range of motion with strict and effective form. So we could potentially select a different exercise to achieve more even stress on the back muscles throughout the entire range of motion. For example, a landmine row may be a slightly better alternative. The landmine row is heavier at the beginning of the exercise and lighter at the end, so this matches well with the tension curves of the movement pattern. This means tension is high throughout the full range of motion, allowing more equal stress on the back muscles throughout the entire movement. A more even tension curve is likely to result in superior hypertrophy, as the muscle is being challenged at all ranges of the movement, not only at a single point. This is likely to result in more uniform overall development of the entire muscle. The next consideration for exercise selection is whether to implement compound or isolation lifts. Compound and isolation lifts can both be effective at promoting muscle growth, but they each have their own unique benefits and limitations, which may affect what we implement for our training routine. Compound lifts involve multiple muscles and joints. This means that we can train more than one muscle with a single exercise. Furthermore, compound lifts involve more stabilizer and accessory muscles, which can also receive somewhat of a training stimulus. This means compound lifts are usually more time efficient, allowing us to train more muscles with fewer exercises. However, compound lifts are also more fatiguing, both acutely and chronically. This means we need to rest longer between sets to recover, since other systems are also fatigued. Because other systems are fatigued, this also means that there is a higher risk that the target muscle won't be the limiting factor for a set. Rather, other muscles or the cardiovascular system could potentially limit performance before the target muscle if technique is off or if rest periods are too short. Isolation lifts, on the other hand, only involve movement of one primary joint, and usually only target a single muscle. This is beneficial in that the target muscle will receive the entirety of the stress and will always be the limiting factor for each set. So no other muscles or systems will limit performance, regardless of how short rest periods are or how close they are taken to failure. Furthermore, isolation lifts are usually less fatiguing from a systemic and joint stress standpoint. However, because isolation lifts only train one primary muscle group, they are generally less efficient than compounds. So both exercise types can have their own unique advantages and limitations, and neither is inherently better than one another. Therefore, it makes logical sense to implement a combination of both compound and isolation lifts. This will allow us to reap the benefits of both forms of training, probably resulting in superior long-term muscle growth. Another consideration for exercise selection is exercise variation. This refers to how many exercises are implemented for each muscle group throughout the training week. Should we only perform one exercise for each muscle, or do we need multiple exercises for each? Well, there is no right or wrong answer here once again, but there are considerations we should explore. The main factor to consider here is regional hypertrophy. it seems that different exercises training the same muscle can result in preferential muscle growth at different portions of the same muscle. For example, this study explored the effects of Smith machine squats versus leg extensions on quad hypertrophy. While both exercises were effective at inducing muscle growth, there was slightly more or less growth at different sites of each quad muscles between the two different exercises. For example, the Smith machine squat seemed to induce greater hypertrophy of the vastus lateralis at the proximal region, which is the area of the quads closer to the hip, while leg extensions resulted in greater growth at the distal region, the area of the quads closer to the knee. This suggests that different exercises may induce more or less muscle growth at different sites of the same muscle. So implementing more than one exercise for a single muscle group may result in more uniform overall development across the entire span of the muscle over time. So in most cases, I would recommend to implement at least 2 exercises for each muscle group across the week, especially if it is a large muscle with multiple movement roles. The next consideration for exercise selection is joint stress. This refers to how much a specific exercise irritates a particular joint or connective tissue. Some exercises are naturally more or less stressful on particular joints, and this is highly individual to each exercise, each joint, and each person. We could go into immense detail on which exercises are theoretically more injurious than others, but the reality is we just need to listen to the pain response of our own tissues. If an exercise tends to irritate a certain joint consistently, then it may be best to simply avoid that lift and use a different one which trains the same muscle group. For example, it is commonly reported that the barbell bench press causes shoulder pain in many lifters, but the dumbbell press doesn't. If we implement exercises that aren't comfortable in our joints and connective tissue, then we may develop pain or injury over time, and this will inhibit our training much more than the exact exercise we implement. So the bottom line is, even if an exercise provides you with a great stimulus, if it consistently causes excessive joint stress, then you are better off switching it for something else. It should also be noted that altering technique can also have a big impact on joint stress too, so it may be worth experimenting with a different technique before switching exercises completely. And the last consideration for exercise selection is personal preference. This refers to an individual's personal attachment to any particular exercise or the consideration for other training goals. In many cases, trainees have other exercises or lifting goals, not only hypertrophy training. So lifters may want to implement some exercises which might not be ideal from a pure hypertrophy standpoint, but also serve another purpose. For example, it is common for lifters to implement a power building style of training where they have a hybrid focus on both powerlifting and hypertrophy training. So even if the barbell squat, bench press, and deadlift are not the best exercise choices for hypertrophy, they are necessary for the individual's strength goals. Furthermore, some lifters may simply prefer some exercises over others for no specific reason, so they may simply choose an exercise because they enjoy it. There is nothing wrong with implementing exercises that you enjoy, you should just understand the trade-offs and make an informed decision. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, we should understand that exercise selection is simply a means to stress the muscle, so there are no mandatory exercises we must implement. However, the exercises we implement should be those which maximize the hypertrophic stimulus and minimize the fatigue cost of training. This would generally include exercises which train the target muscle effectively based on anatomy and biomechanics, those which take the muscle through a larger range of motion, and those with a fairly even tension curve throughout the movement. We should also avoid particular exercises which tend to irritate our joints and connective tissue, and rather stick with those which feel safe and healthy. Within these general guidelines, there are an array of different exercises which can effectively stimulate hypertrophy. So ultimately, there is no best or worst exercises for muscle growth. Trainees should use these general principles to make informed decisions. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.